When I was a little girl, around the third grade, my family lived in a small, rather old house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The house was situated on a lonely dirt road, surrounded by tall, whispering trees that stretched far into the forest. It was a house that had seen better days, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to groan with every gust of wind. The neighborhood was mostly rural, with large patches of forest and winding paths that connected the few houses scattered throughout the area. There wasn't much to do, and as a young child, it felt as though the town had forgotten us. There were very few children my age to play with, and I often spent long hours exploring the woods, searching for imaginary creatures in the brush. Despite the solitude, the house was special to me. It was filled with memories of birthdays, family dinners, and endless laughter. I remember how my grandfather would often visit and spend hours working on home improvement projects. He was a very patient man, and every time I moved into a new room, he would make sure it was absolutely perfect for me. He'd spend days painting the walls, fixing the furniture, and even crafting small wood pieces to decorate the room. It was his way of showing love and effort that made every corner of the house feel warm and welcoming. One day, my grandfather had spent the entire afternoon fixing up my room, painting the walls a soft pastel color, laying down fresh carpets, and even installing a few wooden shelves that he made himself. I remember feeling excited and proud of how beautiful my room looked, as if it was my very own little kingdom. The walls were adorned with soft shades of blue and lavender, and my favorite stuffed animals lined the shelves he had carefully built. The day he finished the work, he smiled and said it was finally ready, and I was eager to settle into it. The room felt like a sanctuary, a space just for me. That evening, as the day turned to night, I lay in my new bed, staring up at the soft glow of the lamp by my nightstand. The room was cozy, and the fresh smell of paint still lingered in the air. The curtains fluttered slightly in the evening breeze that came through the open window, and I could hear the occasional sound of crickets chirping outside. The peaceful sounds of nature usually help me relax, but tonight, there was something about the atmosphere that made me uneasy. It wasn't a typical fear, like the kind of fear a child feels when they're alone in a dark room. This was different, more of a strange, unsettling feeling that I couldn't explain. It was as though the room itself held a secret, something hidden just beneath its serene surface. I shook it off, convinced that it was just my imagination. As I tried to drift off to sleep, I kept thinking about how strange it was that my room had such a calming, almost eerie feeling. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, their forms appearing to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I turned my head quickly, trying to dismiss the sensation as a trick of the light. Still, there was something unsettling about it. I eventually closed my eyes, trying to ignore the sensation in my chest, but it was no use. The silence of the night only seemed to amplify the strange feeling growing within me. I kept hearing faint noises from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the house settling or the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows. The old house had its share of creaks and groans, and the wind would sometimes make the walls seem to whisper. But then I heard footsteps, slow, soft steps approaching my door. The sound was distinct, unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not daring to move. I didn't want to acknowledge it, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the wind. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear them right outside my door. My breath caught in my throat as I held perfectly still, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark. And then, without warning, I heard it, the creak of the door slowly opening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination running wild. But when I opened them again, there, standing in the doorway, was a little girl. She was so still, I could barely make out her features in the dim light spilling from the hallway. Her figure seemed blurry, almost like she wasn't entirely solid, flickering between two worlds. She was wearing a long, white dress that fluttered slightly in the draft, and her hair hung loosely down her back in soft, wavy curls. I blinked a few times, convinced that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the figure remained. She didn't move, she just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't fully comprehend. Her eyes were wide and hollow, with a depth that seemed to go on forever. They weren't eyes that belonged to a living child. There was a strange emptiness to them that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to call out to my parents, but my body felt frozen. It was as if a heavy weight was pressing down on me, keeping me in place. My heart raced as I just stared at her, unable to look away. The silence in the room was deafening, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my heart. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as though the girl's gaze had paralyzed me, trapping me in the moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure began to slowly fade away. Her shape grew more and more translucent, until she disappeared completely, leaving only the faintest impression of her presence in the room. The air felt heavier now, colder, as if something had shifted. The room was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence, one that felt wrong, unnatural. I lay there in bed, wide-eyed and trembling, unable to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one more disturbing than the last. Who was that girl? Why had she appeared to me? What did she want? And most importantly, why had I been unable to move or cry out for help? After that night, I never saw the girl again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the house. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without the overwhelming sense that someone, or something, was watching me, always just beyond the doorway. I would lie in bed, wide awake, staring at the door, half expecting the girl to return. I kept the light on, my eyes darting nervously to the door every few minutes, waiting for the girl to reappear. She never did, but I still wonder about her, who she was, and why she appeared to me that night. As I grew older, I began to dismiss the experience as a figment of my imagination, something a child's mind conjures up in the quiet hours of the night. But the memory of that strange, blurry figure and the coldness in her eyes has never truly left me. Even now, as an adult, whenever I pass that old house, I feel a shiver of unease. It's as though the girl in the doorway is still there, waiting for someone else to see her, to understand the mystery that still haunts that house. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I decided, almost on a whim, to take a walk through the old garden behind my childhood home. The sun was just beginning to climb into the sky, casting a soft golden glow on everything it touched. The kind of morning that invited reflection, nostalgia, and quiet thoughts. As I stood outside my old house, the faint scent of earth and grass brought a flood of memories rushing back to me. The garden had always been my sanctuary as a child, a haven where I could escape from the rest of the world, a place where time seemed to slow down. I spent countless hours there as a kid, playing in the tall grass, reading my favorite books beneath the shade of the ancient oak tree, and letting my imagination run wild. It was a large garden, filled with an abundance of tangled vines creeping over old stone walls, with wild flowers blooming freely in every corner. It was the sort of place that felt enchanted, as though it had its own quiet magic. But over the years, I had moved away, and I hadn't been back in quite some time. So, I thought it would be nice to revisit the place, to relieve some of those memories and perhaps recapture a bit of the peacefulness I had once felt there. As I stepped through the rusted gate and into the garden, a strange feeling washed over me. I hadn't expected the place to look exactly as it did when I was young, but I certainly hadn't expected it to change so drastically. The once vibrant flowers that had filled the garden with color and life were now wilted and brown, their petals brittle and dry. The trees, which had once been tall and proud, their thick green canopies offering shade on the hottest days, now seemed gaunt and bare. The once lush grass underfoot had grown wild and unkempt, towering above my knees in some places. The garden had a sense of neglect, as though it had been abandoned for far longer than just a few years. A melancholy air seemed to hang in the atmosphere, and as I walked deeper into the overgrown space, I couldn't help but notice how still everything seemed. There was an odd emptiness to it, a silence that felt unnatural. The wind rustled through the dry leaves, but even that sound was hollow, distant, as if the very air had grown tired of the world around it. I tried to push the strange sensation aside, telling myself that it was just the passage of time, that the garden was simply showing the signs of age. But the unease in my chest wouldn't subside. Something about the place just didn't feel right. I continued walking toward the back of the garden, where there used to be a small stone bench beneath the overhanging branches of an old willow tree. I remembered spending hours sitting there, reading or just letting my thoughts drift. But as I approached the spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if the garden itself was aware of my presence, as though the earth beneath my feet was holding its breath. I reached the stone bench, which was now covered in moss and crumbling with age, and sat down. The once welcoming space felt foreign now, almost claustrophobic. The tangled vines seemed to close in around me, the rusted fence in the distance loomed like an old, forgotten guardian, and the air was thick with an unsettling energy. That's when I saw it, a figure standing by the farthest tree in the corner of the garden. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees or the branches swaying in the breeze. But as I stared longer, the figure remained, unmoving, as though it were part of the landscape itself. It was tall, unnervingly tall, and cloaked in dark clothing. Its form was shadowed, obscured by the dim light and the overhanging branches, but I could make out the vague outline of a person. It wore a long coat, dark as midnight, and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded its face from view. The figure stood unnaturally still, its posture rigid and unnatural, as though it were carved from stone. I couldn't make out any other details, just the silhouette of a person in the distance. My heart began to race as I stared at it. The garden was abandoned, or so I thought. There shouldn't have been anyone there, especially not someone dressed like that, standing so still in the middle of a garden that had long since been left to decay. No one had come here in years. No one had any reason to. I cleared my throat and called out tentatively, unsure of what I was seeing. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. But the figure did not respond. It didn't even twitch. It stood as though it hadn't heard me, or perhaps didn't care. The silence in the garden was suffocating, and the more I looked at the figure, the more I felt my anxiety grow. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that it was standing there, it was how it was standing, the unnatural stillness of it, as if it didn't belong in this world at all. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. I stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. My feet felt frozen to the ground, unwilling to move. I should have left, I knew that. But something held me there, my gaze fixed on the figure, watching as it remained motionless. My mind raced, and a sense of dread filled my chest. Then, to my horror, the figure began to move. But it didn't walk, not like any normal person. It drifted, floating over the grass without making a sound, gliding toward me in an eerie, unnatural way. The closer it came, the colder the air around me became. I could feel a drop in temperature, as if the very atmosphere were being drained of warmth. A chill ran down my spine, and my legs trembled, but still, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure as it slowly drew closer. Just as it reached the edge of the stone path where I stood, the figure stopped. There was no noise, no sound of feet on grass, no rustling of clothing, nothing. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, facing each other across the overgrown path. The figure's face remained hidden in the shadow of its wide-brimmed hat, and I couldn't tell if it even had eyes. I couldn't tell if it was human. It was as though time itself had stopped. The world held its breath. Then, without warning, the figure turned abruptly and began to walk away, vanishing silently into the thick trees at the far edge of the garden. I stood there, completely still, my heart still racing in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to follow, to understand what it was, to know what had just happened. But another part of me, the part that was drenched in fear, told me to run, to escape, to get out of there before whatever it was decided to come back. In the end, I did neither. I turned away, my legs still weak beneath me, and I left the garden without looking back. The memory of that dark figure haunted me long after I left, and I never set foot in that garden again. Something about it had changed, something beyond the decay of the plants and the crumbling stone walls. The garden was no longer the sanctuary it once had been. It had become something else, something darker. And I could never return to it. It was a cold winter evening when I decided to venture up into the attic of my grandmother's house, a place I hadn't explored in years. The house itself was old, and the attic had always felt like a forbidden space, a forgotten world filled with relics of the past. It had a dim, almost eerie atmosphere, with only a small, grimy window letting in a sliver of weak sunlight. The air was heavy with the scent of musty old books, dust, and the lingering smell of aged wood. As I carefully navigated through the boxes and old furniture, I felt as though I was intruding on a space that had long been left undisturbed, as though the very air was holding onto the memories of those who had lived before me. I began to sort through some old clothes, photographs, and knickknacks that had been tucked away, and that's when I discovered the mirror. It was an antique, large, and imposing, framed in dark, intricately carved wood. The carvings depicted roses, vines, and other delicate patterns, making it seem like something that belonged in another time, another place. The glass was cloudy and cracked in several spots, but there was an undeniable allure to it. It had an aura of mystery, as if it was calling out to me. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but I assumed it must have been passed down through generations of my family. It was oddly heavy, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though the mirror itself wanted to be noticed, to be touched, to be taken into the light after years of neglect. I carefully placed the mirror against the wall, taking a step back to study it. At first, it seemed like any other old mirror, dark, cracked, and unremarkable, but the longer I stared at it, the more I began to feel uneasy. There was something about the reflection that didn't quite add up. It was subtle at first. A shift in the light, a slight distortion of the room, but as I focused more intently, I began to realize that the reflection in the mirror wasn't exactly what was in the room. It seemed to move on its own, as though it were out of sync with the real world. I blinked, convinced it was just the angle or the poor lighting, but the more I looked at it, the stranger it became. The reflection didn't seem to match the space I was standing in, and something about it felt wrong. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of discomfort, but then something happened that made my blood run cold. I noticed a figure standing behind me in the reflection. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I spun around, but when I did, there was no one there. The room behind me was empty. I turned back to the mirror, my heart racing in my chest, and there it was again. The figure. Tall, shadowy, and indistinct. It had no features, no clear form, just a dark shape standing behind me. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I could feel my skin cling with cold dread. I reached out to touch the mirror, hoping to dispel the strange illusion, but as my fingers made contact with the cold, cracked surface, the figure in the reflection seemed to move. It began to shift, drawing closer, as if it were trying to break through the glass and into the room with me. Panic surged through my body. I quickly stepped away from the mirror, but the figure didn't stop. It followed me, always maintaining its position behind me in the reflection. The temperature in the attic dropped, and the air grew thick and suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had turned against me. Then, I began to hear it. A low, whispering sound, like distant voices murmuring just beyond my hearing. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and more distinct, until it felt as though the voices were coming from within the mirror itself, beckoning to me, calling me closer. My heart was pounding in my ears. I was paralyzed with fear. The figure in the reflection reached out, its dark, formless hands stretching toward me. I could almost feel its cold touch on my skin. With a surge of terror, I grabbed the mirror and turned it around, away from me. I couldn't bear to look at it any longer. The whispering stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but I was still trembling, my hands slick with sweat. For a moment, I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to calm myself. When I dared to glance back at the mirror, I saw that it was empty. The shadowy figure was gone, and the mirror was just an old, cracked piece of glass again, reflecting nothing more than the dimly lit attic. I slowly backed away from it, my eyes never leaving the mirror. I didn't know what had just happened or what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to stay in that attic a moment longer. I left the attic that night and never returned. To this day, I still don't understand what happened with that mirror. Every time I think about it, I can still hear the faint whispering in my ears, like a memory lingering in the dark corners of my mind. The image of the shadowy figure still haunts me, and I can feel the cold presence it left behind, as though something is still watching me from the other side of the mirror, waiting for the moment when I might return to look into its depths once more. It was one of those stormy nights that seemed designed to test your sanity. The wind howled outside, twisting around the corners of the apartment building, making the windows rattle with each fierce gust. The rain was relentless, pounding against the glass with such intensity that it sounded like the world outside had forgotten how to be still. The power flickered off and on intermittently, each time plunging the apartment into darkness, before the lights would return, only to flicker again. The house groaned with every gust of wind, its wooden beams creaking as though it, too, was struggling against the storm. I had settled into bed, wrapped in a cozy blanket, hoping the warm glow of my bedside lamp and the distraction of a good book would help me forget the chaos of the weather outside. It was one of those nights when the storm felt almost alive, as though it were trying to claw its way inside. My fingers flipped through the pages of the book, but the sound of the rain against the windows, combined with the occasional rattle of the wind, kept pulling my attention away. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Maybe it was just the storm getting to me, or maybe it was something else, but a strange feeling seemed to hang in the air, thick with anticipation. Then, just as I was starting to lose myself in the pages of my book, I heard it. A knock at the door. The sound was so sudden and unexpected that my heart leapt into my throat. I froze, unsure if my ears were playing tricks on me. The storm outside was so loud, how could anyone possibly be out there knocking at my door in the middle of this tempest? I sat still for a moment, straining my ears, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or perhaps a branch tapping against the door. But then I heard it again. A knock. It wasn't just any knock. It was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakable. My mind raced. It was late, almost midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Who would come to my door at this hour, especially on a night like this? My first thought was that it might be a neighbor, perhaps someone who needed help, or maybe someone who had made a mistake and come to the wrong apartment. But the longer I thought about it, the less plausible that seemed. I stood up cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck rising as I approached the door. My breath quickened, and I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I peered through the peephole, hoping to see anything to explain the knock. But when I looked, there was nothing. No figure standing in the hallway. No shadow cast by a person. Nothing. I frowned, my unease growing. Who could it be? The hallway outside my apartment was empty, and no one had entered the building. I turned to head back to my bedroom, telling myself it was nothing, just a freak occurrence brought on by the storm. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination. But before I could reach the hallway, I heard it again. A knock. But this time, it didn't come from the door. It came from the window. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was coming down in sheets, so how could anyone possibly be standing outside my window, knocking? I slowly turned toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way someone could be out there, not in this storm, not in the middle of the night. The knock came again, a soft but unmistakable sound against the glass. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but I couldn't find one. I stood motionless, staring at the dark, rain-splattered window. No figure was visible, just the rain and the storm. The wind roared as it whipped around the building, but still the knocks continued, growing louder. The sound seemed to come from every direction: at the door, at the window, at the walls themselves. The knocks echoed in the silence of my apartment, each one more unsettling than the last. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I was completely alone. I was terrified, paralyzed, unsure of what was happening. My mind raced through possibilities. Could someone be playing a cruel prank? Could this be some kind of elaborate hoax? I called out into the darkness, my voice trembling as I asked if anyone was there, but there was no response, just the storm and the incessant knocking. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel my sanity slipping away. The knocks seemed to grow louder, more insistent. My pulse quickened, and I fought the urge to run, to hide, to lock myself in the closet and never come out. I walked through the apartment, checking every corner, every room, trying to make sense of the situation. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was as if the storm had stolen all the sound, leaving me in a vacuum of unease. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the walls, my mind unable to escape the feeling that something or someone was out there, waiting, watching. I never figured out what caused the knocks, and I never will. The storm continued outside, as fierce as ever, but the knocking had stopped. Despite that, I couldn't shake the sense of something lurking just outside my apartment, something that hadn't finished with me yet. The next day, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't stay in that apartment, not after what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that the knocks weren't just a coincidence. Whatever was responsible for them was still out there, and it was waiting for the next storm. I never returned to that apartment again, and I never spent another night alone in a place that felt as if it were hiding something sinister just beneath the surface. It was a warm, summer day when my friends and I decided to take a hike through the forest near our hometown. We had often visited the forest during our childhood, wandering through its hidden trails and secret paths, exploring the depths of its beauty and mystery. It was a place where we had made countless memories, from lazy summer afternoons to more daring adventures that had left us with a sense of wonder and a love for nature. But as we grew older, we drifted apart, and our visits to the forest became less frequent. However, on this particular day, we decided to revisit the place, to relive the carefree adventures of our youth and see if it still held the same magic it had once possessed. The forest was dense, its towering trees stretching high into the sky, blocking out much of the sunlight and casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine and moss, and the ground was soft beneath our feet, a combination of fallen leaves and rich soil that seemed to swallow our footsteps. As we followed the trail, we reminisced about the past, recalling the adventures and mischief we had gotten up to as children. We laughed about the silly games we had played and the harmless pranks we had pulled on each other. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, just an odd sensation in the air, like the trees themselves were watching us. We tried to ignore it, dismissing it as nothing more than nerves or our imaginations running wild. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, more tangible, until we could no longer ignore it. We started hearing strange noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and footsteps that seemed to echo around us even though there was no one else in sight. We quickened our pace, trying to move past the growing sense of unease, but the noises only seemed to follow us, intensifying with every step we took. It felt as if we were no longer alone, as if someone was out there, watching us. We reached a clearing, hoping that the open space would offer some sense of relief. The trees parted, and the sun broke through the canopy above, casting beams of light that illuminated the space in front of us. It should have been peaceful, tranquil even, but instead, the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. And then, we saw it. A dark shape, standing just beyond the clearing, watching us. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the trees. But as we stared, the shape remained, unmoving, its outline distinct and unnatural. It was tall, cloaked in black, its form indistinct and formless, as though it were a part of the darkness itself. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, glowed a fierce red, an unnatural light that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intensity. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable, like a weight pressing down on us. It watched us with an unsettling stillness, as though it had been waiting for us. We stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The air felt thick with tension, and none of us could bring ourselves to speak. Should we run? Should we approach it? No one knew what to do, and before we could make any decisions, the figure suddenly vanished. It was gone in the blink of an eye, fading into the trees without a trace. We stood in silence for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. None of us knew what we had seen, but we all felt the same strange unease in the pit of our stomachs. We didn't speak about it again, but we all knew something had changed that day. The forest had become darker, more ominous. The trees seemed taller, their shadows deeper, and the once peaceful forest now felt menacing. Whatever we had encountered in that clearing, it wasn't something we were meant to understand. We never returned to that forest. It was late one evening when I found myself sitting alone in my room, lost in the pages of a book. My family had gone on vacation, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in what seemed like forever. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled or the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. It was the perfect atmosphere for solitude and reflection, and I welcomed the peace and quiet. I had been looking forward to a few days of silence, away from the bustle of everyday life, but I didn't expect to be interrupted. But then, I heard it. A voice, coming from somewhere within the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Perhaps it was a stray sound, a breeze, or the house creaking again. But the voice was clear, so real that I couldn't dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. It was soft, almost gentle, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It seemed to come from somewhere right beside me, as though someone was standing just out of sight, speaking my name in a tone that sounded familiar, almost comforting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what was happening. The voice called my name again, this time more insistent, more urgent. It was melodic, yet there was something haunting about it that sent chills through me. I stood up and called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The silence that followed felt deafening, and for a moment, I questioned whether I had really heard anything at all. But then, the voice spoke again. This time, it was even closer, as if the speaker was standing right behind me. My name was whispered softly, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The voice seemed to brush against my skin, sending a cold shiver through my entire body. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I first entered. My heart raced, and my breath quickened as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. I walked through the house, checking every room, hoping to find some logical explanation for the voice. But there was no sign of anyone. No one was there. Just the empty silence of the house. After a few minutes, I returned to my room, still feeling unnerved by the experience. But just as I began to settle back into my chair, the voice spoke again. This time, it was even more urgent, more desperate, and this time, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. The whisper of my name sent a jolt of fear through me, and I turned around to find nothing but empty air. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain: I was not alone in the house. The voice was real, and it had a presence that was impossible to ignore. I never stayed in that house again, and I never spoke about the voice to anyone. Before we get into the strange happenings, let me give you a clearer picture of the environment we were in. Her bedroom was one of those rooms you could almost get lost in, if you weren't careful. It wasn't huge, but it felt spacious enough, with an atmosphere that almost felt too quiet, like a vacuum that sucked up any hint of life. The room had a comfortable, lived-in quality shelves lined with books and trinkets she had picked up over the years, all scattered around like a chaotic attempt at cozy minimalism. A few plants sat in the corner, though they weren't thriving as well as she hoped, but they added a touch of green, a subtle life to the place. Her bed was the focal point of the room. It was one of those big, plush beds with a thick mattress that almost made you feel like you were sinking into it. It sat nestled in the corner, angled toward the doorway. The blankets and pillows were always arranged just so meticulously neat, even after a long day. To the right of the bed, there were two double-door closets, each packed with clothes, shoes, and miscellaneous items. Nothing unusual, just the typical clutter you'd expect to find in any teenager's room. Behind the bed, the walls were a soft shade of lavender, adorned with a few posters, some of her favorite bands, a few dreamy quotes, and a framed photo of her with her friends from a long-forgotten vacation. All in all, it was a cozy enough space, and I had spent countless nights hanging out there, talking, laughing, and just being with her. This night, though, everything felt different. It had been a typical evening, nothing out of the ordinary. We had gotten comfortable under the covers, and everything seemed fine. We turned off the lights and settled into the stillness of the night, the only sound coming from the gentle hum of the air conditioner running in the background, maintaining a steady coolness in the room. It was supposed to be one of those peaceful nights, no distractions, no interruptions, just quiet and rest. But, as is the case with many nights that start off perfectly normal, something began to shift. Something unseen, something subtle at first. It was only about 4 minutes after we had turned off the lights when I started feeling it. At first, it was faint, like a small shift in the air, almost like a breeze. I didn't think too much of it, since the air conditioner was still running, but then it happened. It felt like something heavy jumped up on the foot of the bed. It was sudden, like a jolt of pressure on the mattress, and it startled me. My heart rate kicked up immediately. I instinctively looked toward her, waiting for some sort of explanation, a confirmation that maybe her dog had snuck in somehow, or perhaps the cat had decided to jump up. But no, her cat and dog were both outside the room. She hated having them on the bed, especially with the fur they left behind. She had told me countless times how she couldn't stand the idea of fur all over her blankets, which was strange because she loved them dearly when they weren't in the way. I nudged her arm, trying to get her attention, but she just shifted slightly, not opening her eyes, not responding in any way that was typical of her. I tried again, this time a little more urgently. I whispered, "Hey, did you feel that? Something just jumped up on the bed. Was that the dog? Please tell me that was the dog." She groaned softly, her voice muffled by the pillow. "Please just ignore it. I don't want to deal with it right now," she said, as if whatever was going on didn't matter. It sounded like she was half asleep, like she didn't really care, like she didn't want to be bothered with whatever was happening. I remember feeling this wave of confusion and frustration at that moment. How could she be so calm about this? Something had just jumped up on the bed. It wasn't just a light tap or a shift in the covers, it felt like actual weight, a tangible presence. I tried to let it go, I really did. But the more I thought about it, the less I could ignore the feeling. The weight on the bed wasn't just there for a second. It lingered, pressing into the mattress, as if someone or something was making its way slowly up toward us. My heart raced as the feeling started to change. It wasn't just a weight at the foot of the bed anymore, it felt like something was crawling up the bed, like someone on all fours, moving closer and closer. The air around us seemed to get colder, heavier, like it was thick with static electricity. I grabbed her arm again, more forcefully this time, but she didn't respond. Her breathing was slow, steady, like she hadn't noticed anything at all. How could she not feel it? I thought, my mind spinning. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my nerves, playing tricks on me. But no, the sensation was too real. It wasn't just the bed. It wasn't just the air. There was something, or someone, moving on the bed with us. I could feel it pressing into the sheets, the slight creak of the mattress under the weight of whatever was there. I couldn't stand it any longer. I needed to do something. I whispered urgently, "Please, wake up. Something is in here. I'm not crazy. I can feel it. Don't you feel that?" Finally, she stirred, but instead of reacting with the alarm I had expected, she sighed heavily and muttered, "Just stop. Don't think about it. It'll go away." Her voice was so calm, too calm, almost as if she had experienced this before, like it was nothing new to her. I sat there in disbelief. Was she not hearing it? Was she not feeling what I was feeling? It was so much more than just the weight. It was as though some presence was crawling up the bed, its movements so distinct, so deliberate. The mattress groaned again under the pressure, and my skin crawled with each second that passed. Every instinct in me screamed that I should get up, turn on the lights, check the room, do anything to stop this unnerving feeling, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move. The crawling continued, closer and closer, inch by inch. I could feel the bed shift beneath me, like whatever it was coming for us. Suddenly, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sensation stopped. The bed seemed to settle, as if whatever had been there had finally left. The air felt lighter again, though the weight of what had just happened lingered. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my hands were shaking. I glanced over at her, desperate for some sort of reassurance, but she was still lying there, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady, as though nothing had happened. She didn't say anything else, and neither did I. I lay there in the silence, the only sound the pounding of my heart and the occasional distant rumble of thunder from the storm outside. But the room felt different now. The peaceful atmosphere I had once felt was gone, replaced by an uneasy tension that I couldn't shake. What had just happened? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something else in that room with us? I didn't sleep much that night, constantly turning over in my mind the strange series of events that had just unfolded. What had crawled up the bed? What had I felt? What was it that made her react the way she did? Why didn't she seem to care? The next morning, everything seemed perfectly normal again. But the unease never fully left me. I couldn't forget what had happened, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there in the room with us, something that wasn't supposed to be. We never talked about it again. She never mentioned it, and I never brought it up. But from that night on, I always made sure to check the corners of the room, to look at the door, and to listen carefully for any sounds that didn't belong. I don't know if it was just a figment of my imagination or something else entirely, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, and I still can't figure out what exactly happened. But I know one thing for sure, that bed activity, whatever it was, wasn't the product of my mind. It was real. Amanda had always been a little more attuned to the energies around her. It wasn't just the normal awareness that anyone might feel in a space, but an acute sensitivity to the subtle shifts in atmosphere that others might dismiss. At first, the noises were faint, a quiet tap, tap, tap from the hallway outside her room. She chalked it up to the building's natural settling, or maybe the sounds of a roommate coming and going. But, as the days wore on, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just a random noise anymore, it was as if someone or something was pacing just outside her door, moving back and forth in a rhythm that felt oddly purposeful. Amanda tried to brush it off. She told herself it was probably just the pipes, or some other noise that older buildings tend to make. But the footsteps persisted, and with each passing day, they became harder to ignore. It wasn't just a passing sound now, but a constant presence. She started to feel as though she could almost hear them when she wasn't even in the room, as though the sound had settled deep into the very fabric of her space. The strange thing was, it didn't sound like it was coming from the hallway at all. The noise felt closer. It felt like it was coming from within the room itself, as though something was walking around in her space when she wasn't there. That wasn't normal. The first time Amanda truly felt the dread of this, she had just returned from class, ready to collapse into her bed. The moment she opened the door, she froze. The sound was there again, but louder, more pronounced now. It was unmistakable footsteps, clear as day, pacing back and forth in her room. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped forward, calling out to anyone who might be there. No answer. There was no one in the room, but the footsteps continued. She rushed inside, scanning every corner, but everything seemed normal. The room appeared just as she had left it, with only her belongings scattered about. She checked under the bed, behind the curtains, and in the closet, but there was nothing out of place. The sound stopped the moment she closed the door behind her. Amanda wasn't sure what to make of it. At first, she told herself she must be imagining it. But the next day, when the sound returned again, there was no denying it. The footsteps weren't just an occasional glitch in the environment, they were a persistent, ongoing phenomenon. She even asked her roommates if they heard anything strange, but they all denied it, leaving her to feel more isolated with her unease. Amanda began to feel like she was losing her mind. It became harder to trust her own senses. Was she really hearing these noises, or was it just the stress of school and everything else playing tricks on her? Desperate for answers, Amanda called in the apartment manager, hoping that maybe the building had some sort of structural issue that was causing the strange sounds. The manager came by and did a thorough inspection, checking for any damage in the walls or floorboards. He assured Amanda that everything appeared fine, but the footsteps persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. The odd thing was, it never seemed to stop. Even when Amanda left the room, she could hear it faintly, just on the edge of her consciousness, as if the presence in her room was following her every move. It felt as though something unseen was watching her, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. Then, one evening, everything changed. Amanda returned from class, her mind buzzing with thoughts of upcoming exams. She walked into her room, absently tossing her bag on the bed, and froze. In the far corner of the room, where the light barely reached, stood a dark shape. It was tall, unnaturally still, and it was human-shaped, but it wasn't quite human. The form was darker than the surrounding shadows, as if it absorbed all the light in the room. It stood there, perfectly still, and for a moment, Amanda wasn't sure if her mind was playing tricks on her. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became that the figure was real and it was watching her. Her breath hitched in her throat as a surge of panic rushed through her body. She instinctively stepped backward, fumbling for her phone to call for help, but then, without warning, the figure vanished. The light flicked on as she scrambled to turn it on, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Amanda's hands trembled as she stood in the middle of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She checked every corner of the room again, but it was as though the figure had simply melted away into the air. The room seemed impossibly quiet, almost too quiet, and Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the room itself had swallowed the shadow, leaving no trace behind. She couldn't explain it. There was no rational explanation for what she had seen, and yet, she knew what she had experienced was real. Someone was in her room. And it wasn't just a figment of her imagination. That night, she barely slept. She kept her lights on and stayed close to her phone, terrified that the shadow might return. But it didn't. The room remained empty, still, silent. As the days wore on, Amanda's anxiety grew. The footsteps continued, but now they weren't just a minor nuisance, they were a constant reminder that something was lurking in the shadows of her room. No one else could hear them, and no one else seemed to understand the dread that was slowly consuming her. The presence in her room had become more than just an eerie sound. It was as though whatever haunted her room was now aware of her presence, and it was growing bolder. Every footstep, every soft creak of the floorboards, was a step closer, a reminder that it was there, watching, waiting. Amanda could feel it now. Whatever it wasn't just an isolated event. It was something that had settled into her life, like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. She tried to shake it off, but each time the sound returned, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a feeling, an oppressive weight pressing down on her every time she stepped into that room. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct with each passing day. And Amanda knew, deep down, that the shadow she had seen in the corner of her room was just the beginning of something much darker. Something that was never going to let her go. It had been an ordinary day, or so I thought. The kind of day that starts with the usual monotony of routine: wake up, get dressed, grab coffee, check the phone for any new messages. I was sitting in my room, trying to focus on my homework, when my phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda. We'd been friends for a while, and I hadn't heard from her for a couple of hours, so I was curious what she wanted. The text that appeared on my screen was simple but strange: "Did my boyfriend come by?" At first, I thought maybe I'd misread it. It wasn't that unusual for her to ask about him, but this didn't seem like the right time. It was the middle of the afternoon. Amanda's boyfriend usually came by in the evenings, after classes had finished for the day. Plus, I had just spoken to her on the phone a few hours earlier, and at no point did she mention anything about him stopping by. Still, I replied, "No," with certainty. I figured it was just a random question, and I was already moving on with my day. But then, another message followed almost immediately. I just heard a man coughing. I frowned at the message, confused. Why would she text me about hearing a man cough? Surely, she must have misheard something, or maybe she was hearing sounds from the hallway. There were always other people coming and going. Still, there was something unsettling about the way she phrased it. She seemed certain. I didn't know why, but I started feeling a little uneasy. I replied, "Are you sure? Maybe someone was passing by outside your room." Her next text, however, wiped away any doubts I had about her sincerity. "I checked the hallway, but there's no one here." That made me pause. Now, I was worried. The idea of a random, disembodied cough made no sense. It was as if there was someone near her, someone who shouldn't have been there. Maybe it was someone in the building, perhaps another tenant who had left their apartment, or even someone in the hallway just outside her door. But why would they cough like that, and why would they do so at the exact moment Amanda had heard it? I decided to go over and check on her. Something about the situation felt off. I wasn't sure if it was my growing concern or just the strange, inexplicable nature of it all, but I knew I had to be there with her. I grabbed my jacket and made my way down the hall, trying to shake the feeling that something more than just a harmless noise was going on. When I arrived at Amanda's door, I found her standing in the entryway, looking more shaken than I'd ever seen her before. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by wide, nervous eyes that darted toward the hallway every few seconds. She seemed on edge, like she was waiting for something to happen, or worse, like she expected something to appear. As soon as she saw me, her expression softened slightly, but the tension in her body didn't leave. I stepped inside, and we both stood there for a moment in the dead silence of her room. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room didn't feel any different from usual, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, like the space was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We stood there for a while, just listening. I could feel the weight of Amanda's anxiety pressing against me, making the air feel thicker, more oppressive. We listened intently, hoping to hear something, anything that might explain what had happened. But there was nothing. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath our feet. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had occurred. Could it have been someone else in the building? Had Amanda perhaps been hearing things? But no, she was adamant that there was no one else in the hallway when she checked. I stepped out into the hallway to check for myself. The sudden chill of the corridor hit me as I walked into the open space, and I immediately felt the stark contrast to the warmth of Amanda's room. The hallway was long, stretching out with a slight curve, its dimly lit fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead. The walls were lined with heavy doors to other rooms, but they were all shut. The floor beneath me was quiet, save for the soft sound of my shoes against the old tile. I paused, straining my ears for any sign of life, anything that might explain Amanda's experience. But there was nothing. The building was eerily quiet. No sounds of people moving about, no distant chatter, no clattering of doors opening or closing, just silence. I checked every corner of the hall, walking up and down, peering into the stairwell and near the elevator, but there was no one around. The building was practically deserted at that hour, with most of the students in class or out on errands. The few who lived on the same floor as Amanda and I were either at work or in their rooms. The place was practically a ghost town, and the emptiness only seemed to add to the strange sense of unease that had settled over us. It was as if whatever had caused Amanda to hear that cough wasn't a physical person at all, it was something else, something far less tangible. I returned to Amanda's room, and we stood there in the middle of the space, feeling utterly helpless. The uncertainty of what had happened gnawed at us both. We hadn't heard anything else, not since the cough. It felt like it had just disappeared into thin air, leaving only the memory of the eerie sound to linger between us. We walked around the building, checking every corner and every door, but we found nothing out of the ordinary. The strange feeling of being watched, however, persisted. It was as if we weren't alone in that place, even though we knew for a fact that no one else was there. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the window, made us jump. It was almost as though the atmosphere had changed, as though some invisible presence had slipped into the space with us. I could see the fear in Amanda's eyes. She was convinced that whatever had caused the cough was something paranormal. She said she felt like it was watching her, like it knew she was there. I didn't know what to think. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was all in her head, but deep down, I couldn't shake the same feeling that something was off, something beyond our understanding. We tried to rationalize it, tried to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the mind, a misinterpretation of sounds or nerves. But the sense that we had just experienced something unexplainable refused to go away. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, trying to distract ourselves from the lingering unease. But the sounds, the feeling of something just out of reach, stayed with us. Even when we tried to laugh about it, the tension was always there, thick in the air, refusing to let us forget. The memory of that single cough, of the shadow we felt but never saw, haunted us, and neither of us knew what it meant. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. The odd feeling faded, though it never completely left. Every now and then, Amanda would look at me with wide eyes and say she thought she heard something, but I never heard it. The cough, the strange presence, it never returned. But every so often, when the wind howled through the hallways or the lights flickered late at night, I would remember that day. And a part of me would wonder, just for a moment, whether Amanda had heard something that none of us were meant to understand. It was just another Friday afternoon, and I was enjoying a rare moment of calm. The academic pressures of the week had lifted for a short while, and I had just finished up some assignments that had been gnawing at me for days. I was lounging in my room, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner in the background, trying to decompress when something broke the silence. At first, it was subtle, a soft tapping sound, almost like someone gently walking across the wooden floor in Amanda's room. It was a familiar sound. But there was a problem. Amanda wasn't home. I checked my phone again, her name still unlit on the screen, no missed calls, no texts. She had left just a couple of hours ago to grab some coffee with a friend and wouldn't be back for a while. So, who or what was making the sound? The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one echoing in the otherwise still air. They were clear, distinct, and unmistakable. I thought for a second that maybe I was imagining things, but the sound persisted. Slowly, I stood up from my desk and began to walk toward her room, heart starting to beat a little faster. Every step I took made the sound more tangible, and with each one, my unease grew. I paused at the door. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I felt a strange sensation in the air, as if the entire room had gone still. It wasn't like silence, it was a thick kind of quiet, a silence that felt wrong, too heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. For a moment, I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I couldn't explain why, but I hesitated. With a deep breath, I slowly turned the doorknob and cracked the door open. I peered inside, half expecting to see someone standing there, or to find some explanation for the sound I had just heard. But nothing. The room was completely still, just as it had been when Amanda left. Everything was exactly in place. The bed was unmade, the desk was cluttered with papers, and the air in the room felt heavier than usual, but otherwise, it was just a room. Empty. Quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stepped back, still unsure of what I had just experienced. I checked the hallway again, but it was empty. No sign of anyone else, no more sounds. The hall was just as silent as the room I had just left. I wanted to convince myself that it had been nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I stood there in the dim hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran through me. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from the cold, it was deeper, more unsettling. I wanted to brush it off, but it lingered, and the unease I felt stayed with me for the rest of the day. I didn't tell Amanda about it at first. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I had imagined the footsteps, that maybe it was the wind or some strange noise from the building. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. And the more I thought about it, the less convinced I was that I had imagined it. The feeling of being watched, the heaviness in the air, everything about it felt too real. Things escalated over the weekend, the very weekend that I would be alone in the dorm. Amanda had gone home to visit her family, and I was left behind with little to do but finish some remaining work and catch up on some reading. It was a late night, around 10 p.m., when things took a strange turn again. I had just finished a long shower, the hot water still fresh on my skin as I stepped out of the bathroom and back into the dim hallway. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the low light, and then something struck me. The hallway lights were off. This wasn't particularly unusual. Sometimes the automatic timers would fail to turn the lights back on, but I distinctly remembered them being on when I went into the bathroom a few minutes before. In fact, I had been sure of it, which only made the absence of light now feel even stranger. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I dismissed the feeling as nothing more than the natural creepiness of being alone at night. I walked toward the light switch near the stairs, flicked it on, and waited for the lights to illuminate the hallway. As the fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life, my eyes moved down the hall, settling on Amanda's door. That's when I saw it. Her room light was on. I froze. Amanda hadn't been home in hours, and I knew for a fact that she always turned her light off when she left, usually as a final gesture before locking the door and heading out. She had a strict routine. So why was her light still on now? It made no sense. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming maybe Amanda had left it on accidentally. But when I reached the door to turn it off, something made me pause again. The door was locked. Amanda never locked her door when she wasn't home. It was something she was adamant about, telling me multiple times that it was unnecessary in our safe, quiet dorm building. She trusted the place, and the only time the door ever got locked was when she was away for long trips, and even then, she would leave the key with me. So why was the door locked now? A shiver ran down my spine. I knocked on the door softly, calling out to her, but no response came. I waited for a moment, still hoping that it was just an oversight, but the silence that greeted me made my skin crawl. I knocked again, harder this time, feeling a growing sense of dread settle over me. There was still no answer. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Could Amanda have come back earlier than expected? No, that didn't make sense. I checked my phone again, still no messages or missed calls from her. My stomach turned, and I felt the weight of the moment press down on me. There was something wrong. Something was off. I stood there for a long time, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the door, something that I wasn't meant to understand. When Amanda finally returned later that weekend, I asked her about the light, hoping for some rational explanation. She looked confused at first, and then she said something that only deepened my unease. She confirmed that she had, in fact, turned off the light before leaving. She even remembered checking the room before she left, ensuring that everything was in order. And yet, when she came back, the light had been on. When we both checked the room together, it was as if nothing had changed. It was exactly as she had left it. But the feeling of something lingering in the air, that strange weight, refused to leave. The room felt the same, silent, heavy, and unchanged, but that eerie sense of being watched didn't disappear. That night, neither of us could sleep properly. We both lay awake, listening for any strange noises or movements, but the building was quiet. The next few days felt like a blur. I kept expecting to hear footsteps again or to feel the oppressive weight of whatever was in the air, but nothing happened. It was as if the dorm had returned to normal. But that didn't ease the unease in my chest. Every now and then, Amanda would glance nervously at the hallway, and I would catch myself listening closely for any sign of movement in the empty building. The strange events had left a mark on us both, and no matter how hard we tried to shake it off, we couldn't forget the eerie sensation that something unseen was still lurking, watching, waiting. We were both haunted, though we never spoke of it aloud. The silence continued, but it felt different now, like it was holding its breath. It had been happening for weeks, and for some odd reason, neither Amanda nor I ever really addressed it directly. There was this constant, pervasive presence in our apartment, something that we couldn't quite shake. It started out innocently enough, or so we thought. The distinct, unmistakable smell of cigarette smoke began to appear in our apartment suddenly, without any apparent cause. We lived in a non-smoking building, and neither Amanda nor I smoked, so it didn't make sense. The smell wasn't overwhelming at first, it was faint, almost like someone had recently smoked outside, and the wind had carried the scent into the apartment through the open windows. It didn't seem like anything to worry about. Just a passing inconvenience. But the days went on, and the smell began to grow stronger. At first, it was something we could ignore, just a faint odor that lingered in the air and dissipated in the span of a few minutes. Maybe someone had just smoked in the vicinity of the building, we reasoned. But as time passed, it became more persistent. It started to hang in the apartment, thick and pungent, as if it had somehow seeped into the walls and furniture. No matter how many times we opened the windows, cleaned, or tried to air out the apartment, the smell lingered. It wasn't just any regular cigarette odor, it was a heavy, oppressive stench, almost overwhelming. It wasn't the typical scent of cigarette smoke you might find in an ashtray or lingering in the air after a smoker walks by. This smelled sour, like something far older and more neglected. The kind of smell that sticks to your clothes, your hair, your skin. It had a rank, burnt quality that made it difficult to ignore. The kind of smell that made the air feel thick, like you could taste it on your tongue. Every room we walked into seemed to be saturated with it. I started to question if someone in the building was sneaking around, smoking in the hallways, or perhaps out of sight outside the window. Maybe they were puffing away in the stairwell or behind the building, and the smell was seeping in through the cracks. But as I thought more about it, things didn't add up. No one else in the building seemed to notice the smell, and the few people I casually asked about it gave me confused looks. Cigarettes? I haven't smelled anything like that. So, it was only Amanda and me who could detect the odor. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it felt more than just a weird coincidence. It felt as if the smell was specifically targeting us, like it was following us, lurking in the corners of our apartment. Every time we walked into the living room, it was there. Every time we walked into the kitchen, it was there. We were never far from it. As the days wore on, I began to feel like the apartment was being overtaken by something unseen. It was as though the apartment had become a kind of container for this unsettling presence, one that we couldn't control or explain. We tried everything to get rid of the smell. I bought air fresheners, cleaned the entire apartment, and even bought some expensive candles, hoping to mask the scent, but nothing worked. The moment we thought the air was fresh again, the smell would return, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but always there, like an uninvited guest. The strangest part was that it wasn't just the smell that was making things feel off. Other odd things began happening in the apartment, things that made no sense. For example, one evening, I returned to the apartment after spending some time with my boyfriend. It had been a lovely evening dinner, conversation, a little laughter. I was in high spirits, feeling completely normal, and as I walked into the apartment, I noticed something strange. The door was locked. Now, this might not seem like a big deal at first. But here's the thing, I hadn't locked it when I left. I always had a habit of double-checking the locks when I was heading out, but this time I had been rushing to meet my boyfriend and had simply left the door slightly ajar. The apartment was on the second floor, and we had lived in the building for several months without any issues. The thought of someone coming in to lock the door seemed ridiculous, but there it was, the deadbolt was locked, the door completely secure. There was no way anyone could have entered the apartment without me hearing it. The only person who had been in the apartment with me was Amanda, and she had left earlier in the day. She wasn't even around when I came back. I stood in front of the door for a few moments, unsure of what to do. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I had mistakenly locked it without realizing, but that didn't explain the unease I felt. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. How could it have locked itself? The door was old, and the lock had always been temperamental, but never like this. I reached out and slowly turned the knob, my fingers trembling slightly. I pushed the door open, and everything looked just as I had left it. Nothing was disturbed, nothing out of place. But the feeling of something being wrong hung heavily in the air. It was like the apartment had shifted, subtly and imperceptibly, into something that wasn't quite right. I called Amanda later that evening and asked her if she had locked the door when she left. Her voice was calm, but she sounded just as confused as I was. No, I didn't lock it. I didn't even think to lock it when I left. Are you sure it was locked when you got home? She seemed genuinely puzzled. Neither of us could explain it, and we both laughed it off, but the strange feeling lingered in the back of my mind. The smell of cigarettes only seemed to intensify after that. It was like it was becoming more aggressive, as though it was trying to assert its presence in a way that made us both uneasy. It didn't matter what we did, open the windows, clean, light candles, the smell came back, stronger than ever. It was as though the apartment was alive with it, the walls soaked in the sour stench of cigarettes. I began to notice other oddities as well. Items that had been left in one place suddenly appeared somewhere else. A mug I had left on the counter would be sitting on the kitchen table when I returned from a quick errand. My jacket would be folded neatly on the couch when I knew I hadn't touched it. It wasn't just random occurrences, it was as if something or someone was tampering with our things. These small, subtle intrusions felt invasive, like invisible fingers moving things around, subtly pushing the boundaries of our space. The apartment seemed to change with every passing day, a creeping sense of discomfort taking over. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was waiting just around the corner. I had never been a superstitious person, but I was starting to question what was really happening. Was the apartment haunted? Was it just our minds playing tricks on us? Or was there something far darker at work in the shadows? Amanda started to feel it too. One night, she asked me if I had noticed the strange vibrations in the walls, as though something heavy was moving behind them. I hadn't heard anything like that, but the idea of it made my skin crawl. We were both afraid to stay alone in the apartment after dark, and we started avoiding being in the place as much as possible, spending more time at cafes or with friends. But no matter where we went, the smell of cigarettes seemed to follow us. It wasn't just a physical smell anymore, it felt like it was in our minds, in our memories, always hovering at the edge of our consciousness. We didn't speak about it much. We didn't have to. We both knew that something was wrong, and yet neither of us knew what to do about it. The apartment had changed, and we were no longer just two people living in a space. We were two people trapped in something we couldn't explain, something that had slowly seeped into our lives, one strange phenomenon at a time. And the smell, that constant, suffocating presence, never left. It was as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And we were just waiting too. Waiting for it to stop. Waiting for an explanation that never came. Over the past few days, I had noticed that Amanda had been increasingly on edge. There was an unease about her, a heightened tension that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't like her to be so jumpy, but lately, she seemed to be constantly looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously to corners of the room that weren't there before. And then one night, as we sat together in the living room, she finally told me something that chilled me to the core. It started as a vague feeling, she said, an unsettling sensation of being watched, like there was someone standing just out of sight, always there but never quite visible. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind, but then it escalated. Slowly, the feeling grew more intense, more real. And then, one night, it became undeniable. Amanda had seen something, or rather, someone in her closet. I could tell from her voice that this wasn't some silly dream or passing thought. This was something that had shaken her to the very core. She described it to me as best as she could, though her words trembled as she spoke. The figure was tall, impossibly dark, and stood in the closet in a way that felt unnatural. It moved only when she wasn't looking, like some dark shadow that waited for the perfect moment to shift. Every time she turned her head or blinked, it seemed to shift its position slightly. But there was something even more terrifying about the way it moved. It didn't move like a normal person would. It was like it was part of the darkness itself, a figure that blended with the shadows, only solidifying when she wasn't paying attention. The thing didn't even have a face. No features, no eyes, no expression. Just darkness. At first, I tried to be rational. I told her it was probably just her imagination running wild. It had been a stressful few weeks, and I figured that maybe she had been overwhelmed, tired, or just anxious. But Amanda wasn't convinced. She was adamant about what she had seen, and more importantly, she was terrified. Her fear was palpable, hanging in the air between us like a heavy fog. The look in her eyes made it clear that she wasn't just telling me a story for attention. She truly believed that something had been watching her. I asked her to describe the figure in more detail, but she couldn't. She was only able to offer vague descriptions, things that didn't quite add up, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit together. It wasn't like a human being, it was something else, something darker. She said it felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in the world, like it was something that had slipped through the cracks of reality. There was an oppressive weight to its presence, a suffocating pressure that seemed to fill the entire room whenever it appeared. But it wasn't trying to hurt her, she said. It wasn't violent. It wasn't threatening, at least not in the way one might expect from a ghost. Instead, it felt like it was just waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for her. As though it were content to simply be there, standing in the dark, its hollow, faceless form watching her, not to cause harm, but to keep her company in the most unsettling way possible. I didn't know what to say. I tried to comfort her, to reassure her that it was all in her head. Maybe it was a product of stress, or maybe she was just seeing things in the half-light of the room. But deep down, I knew she wasn't lying. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong in that apartment. And then, it got worse. One evening, Amanda spoke again, her voice strained with fear. She told me that she had heard a name that kept echoing in her mind. A name that had come to her in whispers, carried by the silence of the night. Henry, she said softly, almost as if saying the name aloud would somehow make it more real, more tangible. At first, I didn't understand. Henry? I asked, not sure what she meant. Who is Henry? Amanda explained that, in the stillness of the night, when everything was quiet and the apartment was dark, she had heard the name whispered through the walls. She could never explain it, couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but she was certain of what she had heard. It was almost like the name was being spoken from inside the walls themselves, a faint whisper that slipped through the cracks like a ghost, impossible to ignore. It wasn't her imagination, she said. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. The name Henry felt real. At first, I was confused. Why Henry? Why that name? But as Amanda spoke, I began to understand. She believed that the name was tied to the shadowy figure in her closet. It was almost as if the entity, whatever it was, had a name. Henry had become more than just a name. It was part of the haunting, part of the growing mystery that seemed to envelop us. The figure in the closet, the one that had been waiting in the darkness, now had an identity. Henry. It wasn't just an anonymous presence anymore, it was something with a purpose, something that was trying to make itself known. It was trying to communicate with her, in whatever way it could. As the days went on, the apartment seemed to grow heavier. The air felt thick, as if the very walls of the building were closing in on us. The once warm and comforting space we had called home now felt oppressive, like it was slowly suffocating us. The smell of cigarette smoke that had been lingering for weeks became more pronounced, and the atmosphere grew darker, colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, creeping further into every room. The figure, Henry, seemed to be more active now. Amanda would see it in the closet, standing just beyond her reach, waiting. It didn't matter what she did, it always returned. It would always be there, standing in the shadows, watching. I started to feel it too. The sensation of being watched was no longer just Amanda's imagination. It was real. It was as though the figure was always there, always just out of sight. The weight of its presence grew heavier with each passing day, suffocating us both. It was no longer a vague sense of discomfort, it was something tangible, something we could feel in our bones. We tried to talk about it, but the more we spoke, the more we realized that there were no answers. No explanations. The name Henry kept echoing in my mind, and the darkness seemed to grow deeper, darker. We could no longer pretend it was just in our heads. The apartment had become a place of fear, a place where we felt trapped. The entity Henry was not just a ghost. It was something more. Something that had been here long before us. Something that had always been waiting. And now, it seemed that the waiting was over. The apartment was no longer a home. It had become a prison. A place where we were stalked by an unseen force, trapped with no escape. And the figure, Henry, continued to haunt us, standing in the shadows, watching. Always watching. We were powerless to stop it. The mysterious face in the hotel. It was the summer when I was 5 years old, and my parents decided to take a much-needed holiday. They booked a stay at a hotel that, to my young eyes, seemed like a relic from another time. It wasn't that the place was ancient, but there was something about it that felt stuck in the past, as if it had been trying to cling on to the early 2000s in a way that no longer seemed fashionable. The decor was a mix of outdated design choices that never really worked together, patterns that clashed, faded carpets, and old floral wallpaper peeling slightly at the edges. The furniture was heavy and dark, reminding me of what a hotel might have looked like if it had been designed in the late 1990s and then never updated. We arrived at the hotel on a sunny afternoon, with the heat outside still lingering in the air. The room itself was simple but cozy enough, a safe little sanctuary for a family looking to unwind. After we unpacked, I remember exploring the room with a sense of curiosity. The bed was large and soft, the dresser was old-fashioned, and the small window let in just enough light to make the room feel inviting. But there was something about it that I couldn't quite shake, a strange, unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air, as if the room itself were waiting for something. I was just a little kid, so I probably wasn't old enough to fully understand the nuances of my surroundings, but there was a certain eerie feeling to the place that I couldn't explain. Later that evening, after dinner, my parents turned off the lights and the hotel quieted down to a peaceful hush. It was then that something happened that I'll never forget for as long as I live. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, disoriented by the pitch-black darkness surrounding me. As a 5-year-old, I wasn't yet accustomed to the idea of being completely alone in the dark, and the unsettling silence of the room only made things worse. My first instinct was to crawl into my mom's bed for comfort. The night light outside the room was dim, and the only sounds I could hear were the distant hums of the hotel's air conditioning. I carefully slid out of bed, my small feet stumbling across the soft carpet as I tried to make my way to my parents' bed. But as I moved across the room, something caught my attention in the far corner. It was a face. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, a trick of the dim light, perhaps. But no, the longer I stared, the more real it became. The face seemed to float in the darkness, an eerie, pale white that seemed to stand out against the deep shadows. The eyes were dark, almost hollow, and the nose was small, delicate, almost too perfect in a way that felt unnatural. It looked lifelike in the sense that it seemed to possess a strange, otherworldly quality, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. My heart froze, and my body went rigid with fear. It was like the face was watching me, staring back into my eyes, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I was frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Every instinct in my body screamed that I should run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the face. It was as if it was calling to me in some way, as though it wanted me to acknowledge its existence. I called out in a soft, trembling voice, "Mom." My voice was weak and shaky, barely above a whisper. But when my mom turned on the lamp and I looked toward her, I saw that she was on the opposite side of the room, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with confusion. She had no idea what I was talking about. I spun back toward the corner of the room where I had seen the face, but it was gone, vanished without a trace, as though it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked at my mom, who had now gotten out of bed and was standing near the lamp. She didn't seem frightened. In fact, she thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, a figment of my childish mind. But I knew what I had seen. I could still picture the face in my mind, as vivid as if it had happened just moments ago. There was no denying what I had experienced. It wasn't something I could easily brush off. Over the years, I tried to make sense of what happened that night. The memory remained etched in my mind, haunting me in a way I couldn't explain. The more I thought about it, the more questions began to surface. Who or what had I seen that night? What was that face? Could it have been a trick of the shadows, a figment of my imagination? Or had I truly encountered something supernatural? The strangest part of the experience, though, was that my mum and I couldn't even remember the name of the hotel. We had stayed there for a few days, but the hotel's name had slipped from our minds as if it had never existed. We looked through old photos, hoping to find some clue that might help us recall where we had stayed, but nothing ever came up. It was as if the memory of that place had been wiped clean from our minds. The absence of this key detail made the experience even more bizarre, as though the hotel itself and perhaps the face I had seen were connected to something that wasn't meant to be remembered. I often wondered if the place had a hidden history, a past filled with stories of hauntings, old legends, or events that had been buried over time. Could the face have been the ghost of someone who had once stayed there, a restless spirit unable to move on? Or was it something more sinister, a presence drawn to the room for some unknown reason? The possibilities swirled in my mind, but I couldn't answer them. I would never be able to investigate the hotel's history to find out what might have happened there. As the years passed, I tried to dismiss the experience as just an overactive imagination, something that could be chalked up to childhood fears and dreams. But deep down, a part of me still believed in what I saw. I'll never know what truly happened that night, but the strange, pale face continues to linger in my memory, a reminder of the mysteries that the world holds, mysteries that may never be fully understood. The rocking chair and unseen forces. When I was 6 years old, I was at that age where curiosity was beginning to push me to explore the world beyond the safety of my immediate family and home. It was an exciting time, where the smallest things could make my imagination race, and even the most mundane details in my environment seemed to hold endless possibilities. My house, a creaky old structure with tall windows, heavy curtains, and wooden floors that groaned underfoot, was my world. I knew every inch of it, from the attic where forgotten boxes were stored, to the basement where the smell of damp earth always seemed to hang in the air. It was home, and I felt safe there, wrapped in the warmth of family and the comfort of familiar surroundings. One evening, after a simple family dinner, I plopped down on the couch in the living room, eager to watch my favorite show on the old television set. The room was quiet, the soft glow from the TV flickering on my face as I settled into the cushions. The sounds of the night outside filtered through the thin curtains, but there was nothing unusual about that evening, just a typical night in our old house. My parents were sitting nearby, engaged in their own conversations or reading a book. It seemed like just another peaceful night. There was no hint, no foreshadowing, of the strange events that would unfold in the following moments. As I sat there, trying to focus on the screen, I noticed something odd from the corner of my eye. It was subtle at first, almost like a trick of the light or a shadow moving. The old wooden rocking chair, which had been placed in the corner of the room for as long as I could remember, began to sway back and forth. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a natural occurrence. The chair had been sitting there for years, never used, and maybe the wooden floor beneath it had shifted a little. Perhaps it was simply the weight of the old frame creaking in the stillness of the room. But then, the movement grew more pronounced. The chair didn't just rock slightly anymore, it was swaying, back and forth, almost as though something or someone was sitting in it, gently shifting their weight. The movement wasn't violent or abrupt, but it was steady, rhythmic, as though the chair was being rocked by an invisible hand. My heart began to race in my chest as I continued to watch, transfixed by the sight of the chair in motion. It was as if something was trying to make its presence known, but I couldn't understand what. I glanced around the room, hoping to find some logical explanation, something that could explain this strange occurrence. The windows were open, but the night air was still, not even a breeze to stir the curtains. The walls were silent, and the rest of the room remained undisturbed. There was no wind, no source of movement, just the chair, gently rocking back and forth, almost inviting me to come closer and investigate. But I didn't move. My mind was racing, but my body felt frozen in place. Fear started to seep into my thoughts, but I tried to calm myself. I told myself I was just imagining things. That maybe the chair was simply old and creaky, and maybe the house was just settling. It was nothing. I tried to ignore it. But then, the situation escalated. Out of nowhere, a cup that had been sitting innocently on the shelf above the fireplace suddenly flew off and crashed to the floor with a loud bang. The sound was deafening, reverberating throughout the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place, my eyes wide with terror. There was no reason for it. No wind, no animals, no one else in the room. Just the cup, hurtling through the air and shattering on the wooden floor. My body went rigid, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Panic began to rise within me, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt as though they were glued to the floor. Then, as if to add to the growing unease, the radio sitting silently on the table in the corner of the room suddenly sprang to life. The static crackled loudly, filling the room with a strange, Eerie noise. The radio wasn't even plugged in, or at least I didn't think it was, and yet, there it was, the sound of static filling the room. Slowly, the static faded, replaced by a faint, old-timey music station. The soft sound of a piano melody drifted through the air, but it was out of place, jarring in its surrealness. My eyes darted from the chair to the radio to the shattered cup on the floor, and my heart was pounding in my chest. Terrified and confused, I bolted from the room, my small feet pounding against the wooden floor as I raced to my parents' bedroom. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck. When I burst through the door, my parents were half asleep, still in their bed, looking up at me with surprise as I tried to explain what had just happened. Between frantic breaths, I told them about the chair, the cup, and the radio. They listened patiently, but I could tell they weren't convinced. They got out of bed and followed me back to the living room, but when we arrived, everything was exactly as it had been before. The chair had stopped rocking, the radio was silent, and the room was calm once again. The shattered cup lay on the floor, but there was no sign of anything unusual. It was as though the strange events had never occurred. My mom, ever the pragmatist, quickly brushed it off as nothing more than a series of coincidences. A cup had fallen off the shelf, the chair had creaked, and maybe the radio had malfunctioned. She suggested it was just my overactive imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt in that room. There was something there, something I couldn't explain. I couldn't dismiss it, no matter how hard I tried. My mind told me it was just a series of random events, but my heart told me otherwise. I could still feel the presence in the air, as though something or someone had made itself known. For weeks after that night, I couldn't bear to be alone in the living room. I'd tiptoe around the area, glancing nervously at the rocking chair, half expecting it to start moving again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been trying to reach out to me. And though I tried to put it out of my mind, the memory lingered, always in the back of my thoughts. There was something about that night that I couldn't forget. Something unseen, something that I couldn't explain, had made its presence known in our house, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. As the years passed, I tried to rationalize the event, convincing myself it was just a fluke, a combination of my imagination and the quirks of an old house. But even now, I can't help but wonder. Was it just an odd coincidence? Or was there something more to it, something unseen, something that couldn't be explained? I still think about the rocking chair, and sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see it move again. The memory of that night remains with me, a haunting reminder that not everything in this world can be easily explained, and that sometimes, the forces at play in our lives are beyond our understanding. The ghost I walked through. Throughout my life, I've had many strange experiences, some that left me with lingering unease, others that I could brush off as mere coincidences or tricks of the mind. But one event, in particular, stands out, and every time I think about it, I can't help but feel a mix of disbelief, amusement, and wonder. It was a regular afternoon, one of those quiet, uneventful days when you're caught up in the rhythm of mundane chores, moving from one task to the next without much thought. But little did I know, I was about to encounter something that would change my perspective on the unseen world forever. It was a simple day. The sun was hanging lazily in the sky, casting its pale light through the windows. The air felt still, and the house was unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. I was just finishing up cleaning the hallway upstairs, and my mind was preoccupied with the usual nonsense, what I would eat for lunch, which shows I still needed to catch up on, the list of things I had yet to do. The dull hum of everyday life surrounded me, and I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings. My focus was entirely on moving through the motions, one chore after another, as I descended the stairs to grab something to eat. As I reached the top of the stairs, I felt the cold, damp air of the hallway pressing against me. I didn't think much of it after all. The hallway always felt cold, like it was permanently trapped in a shadowy haze. The light from the window barely reached that part of the house, leaving it in a constant twilight state. So, I made my way toward the stairs, barely glancing up as I took the first step down. But as I moved forward, something strange caught my peripheral vision. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I looked again and there it was. Standing directly in my path, blocking the stairs as if it had always been there, was a tall, black figure. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow that didn't quite belong in the world of the living. The figure shimmered faintly, as if it was made of something intangible, like smoke or mist, but still, I could make out the outline of its form. Its height was unnerving, tall and almost inhuman, with its edges fraying into the dim light around it. There was no face, no features, just a vague, shadowy presence. I stopped in my tracks, but to my surprise, there was no sudden rush of fear. No cold sweat or heart-racing panic. My first instinct, which in hindsight I find both odd and amusing, wasn't to run or scream. I wasn't even frozen by fear. Instead, I felt annoyed. Hungry. I had been planning to go downstairs for a snack, and this figure was blocking my way. I didn't have time for ghostly encounters. So, without a second thought, I did the most absurd thing I could have done. I walked straight through it. It wasn't like walking through a physical object. There was no resistance, no chilling touch, no sense of discomfort. It was as if the figure wasn't even aware of me, or perhaps it didn't care. It was a strange sensation, like walking through a cool breeze or a dense fog, but without the usual sense of unease that such things would bring. The figure didn't move or react, and I certainly didn't feel any sense of danger. I simply continued on my way, moving down the stairs as if nothing had happened. In the back of my mind, I knew what had just occurred wasn't something I could easily dismiss. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a fleeting moment of forgetfulness. There was a tangible presence, something not of this world, standing in front of me. But I was too focused on the hunger gnawing at me to care. The kitchen, with its promise of food, called to me more urgently than any supernatural entity. I barely even spared the figure a second glance as I walked on, my feet echoing softly against the wooden stairs. When I reached the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. How could I have just walked through a ghost without a second thought? Normally, I would have been terrified. The idea of a shadowy figure standing in my path would have sent anyone else into a panic, but not me. That day, the figure seemed to lack any real significance. I was too irritated, too hungry, too absorbed in my own little world to feel anything else. It felt like an odd, detached experience, almost like I was a spectator in my own life, watching myself brush past something that should have shaken me to my core. Looking back on it now, I can't help but laugh at how unaffected I was. It seems so absurd. There I was, walking through an apparition like it was no more than a passing breeze, too distracted by my hunger to acknowledge it. If I had encountered that ghost at any other time, I would have probably been paralyzed with fear. But not that day. My focus was on something so trivial, something as simple as the need for food, that the presence of a ghost was barely an afterthought. However, what I find most fascinating about that encounter is the way it solidified my belief in the paranormal. Before that moment, I had always been skeptical, unsure of what to make of stories about ghosts and otherworldly forces. But after walking through that shadowy figure, I couldn't deny that there was something beyond the physical world. Something invisible, something that couldn't be explained by logic or science. The figure wasn't a mere trick of the light, nor was it a product of my imagination. It was real, in some unexplainable way, and I had walked right through it as if it wasn't even there. It left me with more questions than answers, and I realized that the world around us is full of things we'll never understand. That moment also changed the way I looked at the unknown. I've encountered other strange experiences since then: noises in the middle of the night, objects moving on their own, and fleeting glimpses of figures in the corner of my vision. But nothing quite matches the sheer indifference I felt that day. Walking through that ghost was, in a strange way, empowering. It made me realize that I had control over how I reacted to these occurrences. I could choose to be frightened, or I could simply go about my business, just as I did that afternoon. In the end, it wasn't the supernatural that held power over me, it was my own perception, my ability to decide what was worth my fear and what was not. Years have passed since that afternoon, and every time I think back on it, I'm reminded of how easy it would have been to let fear control me. But instead, I walked right through the ghost, unaffected and undeterred. Maybe that's what the experience taught me, that the things we fear aren't always as powerful as we think. Sometimes, we give them too much power, allowing them to control our thoughts and emotions. But in the end, they're just shadows, flickers in the dark, nothing more than fleeting figures in a world full of uncertainty. And sometimes, it's best to just keep walking, not letting them stop us from living our lives. The phantom in the floral shop. When I look back on my late teens, I often think about my time working in the small, family-owned floral shop in the heart of town. It was a quaint little place, tucked away in a quiet corner, its wooden sign creaking in the breeze as it swayed in the wind. The building was old, with a history that seemed to seep through its walls. It had been there for decades, maybe even longer, dating back to the early 1900s. The atmosphere was always cozy, yet there was something about it that felt slightly off. The moment I stepped through the door, I was greeted by the earthy scent of fresh flowers, a fragrant mixture of roses, lilies, and jasmine that seemed to settle in the air and linger long after you'd left. The soft rustling of leaves as the wind passed through the slightly cracked windows only added to the charm of the place, but there was an odd, unshakable heaviness in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible weight that pressed down on you. I worked alongside a group of women, all of them older than me, most of them in their 50s. They were seasoned veterans of the floral trade, and I quickly came to admire their skill and knowledge of the craft. They were kind and welcoming, always willing to teach me the ropes, though they did so with a certain air of nonchalance, as if the shop was their second home, something they'd known for so long that it was just part of them. The older women had worked there for years, some even decades. They had their routines, their little rituals, and they spoke of the shop's history with a kind of reverence, almost as if the building itself had a soul. They told stories of customers who had been coming for years, of families who'd passed through the doors, and of how the shop had changed over time. But what they never spoke of, at least not to me, were the strange occurrences that seemed to have become part of the shop's unspoken lore. At first, I didn't notice anything particularly unusual. It was just a normal floral shop, filled with the usual bustle of people ordering bouquets for weddings, funerals, anniversaries, and birthdays. There was always something new to do, arranging flowers, cleaning the counters, and taking orders. But over time, I began to sense that there was something more to the shop than met the eye. It wasn't anything I could easily put into words, but there was a strange energy that seemed to linger in the air, as if the walls themselves were steeped in old memories. I often found myself glancing over my shoulder when I was alone in the shop, as though I could feel eyes watching me, though there was no one there. I'd chalk it up to my imagination. Of course it was easy to explain it away as my nerves getting the better of me. After all, working alone in a small shop late at night could do that to anyone. But then, one afternoon, as I was walking through the quiet shop, something happened that I couldn't easily dismiss. I had been moving from one side of the store to the other, lost in my own thoughts, when I happened to glance over at the armchair near the back window. It was a worn, velvet chair that had clearly seen better days, its fabric faded and frayed around the edges. The chair was positioned in a quiet corner of the shop, a place where customers often sat while waiting for their orders to be prepared. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, and yet, there was something oddly inviting about that corner, like it was a place where time slowed down, where the world outside didn't matter. To my surprise, when I glanced at the chair, I saw an elderly man sitting there. His white hair was neatly combed to the side, his dark suit, though old-fashioned, appeared well maintained. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his back straight, his gaze cast downward as if lost in thought. The sight was startling, as I had never seen him before. He didn't seem to be a customer, nor did he seem to belong to anyone in the shop. He looked almost like he had simply materialized out of thin air. For a moment, I stood frozen, my heart beating a little faster as I tried to process what I was seeing. But as I turned fully to face him, the man was gone. The chair was empty, the space around it eerily still. I shrugged it off, telling myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, it had been a long day, and I had been running around the shop, trying to keep up with the demands of the business. But the next time I passed that same chair, I saw him again. The man was sitting there, as if he had never left. His presence was just as tangible as before, and for a split second, I thought I must have imagined it again. But when I turned my head fully toward the chair, I saw that it was empty once more. It happened several more times over the next few weeks. Each time I glanced over, I'd see him sitting there, his quiet presence a constant fixture in the corner of my vision. But whenever I looked directly at him, he vanished. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was just overtired, stressed, or starting to lose my grip on reality. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't just a trick of my mind. The man, whoever he was, had become a regular part of the shop, a phantom who had chosen to make his presence known. There were times when I'd be so caught up in my work that I'd forget about him, only to turn around and find him sitting there again. And then, when I focused my attention on him, he would disappear. It was as though he were some sort of permanent fixture in the shop, an unseen guest who didn't quite belong in the physical world but refused to leave. One afternoon, while I was doing some chores in the cramped utility room at the back of the shop, I turned around and came face to face with the man. He was standing right behind me, as though he had materialized out of nowhere. I hadn't heard a sound, no footsteps or rustling. He was just there, his old-fashioned suit and white hair standing out starkly against the dim light of the utility room. I gasped in surprise and, without thinking, shouted at him, demanding to know why he was sneaking around. But when I turned to face him, he was gone, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. From that day on, I never saw him again. It was as if he had disappeared completely, never to return. I don't know what happened, whether he was a spirit, a ghost, or just the lingering presence of someone who had once been a part of that shop. Perhaps he was connected to the shop in some way, perhaps he had worked there in the past, or perhaps his memories had become intertwined with the place itself. Whatever the case, I could never shake the feeling that he was somehow tied to the shop's long history, a shadow of the past that refused to fade away. Over time, I came to accept the oddities of the shop as just another part of its charm. The old building, with its creaky floors and dusty corners, had a way of holding on to the memories of those who had come before. The women who had worked there for years often spoke of the shop's long history, but they never mentioned anything about the ghost I'd seen, or if they did, it was in passing, as though it were just another quirk of the place. Even now, when I think back on those days, I'm not sure what I encountered in that floral shop. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, a product of the shop's old energy and my young, impressionable mind. But one thing I do know for sure is that I'll never forget the phantom man in the velvet chair, and the strange feeling of knowing I had witnessed something beyond explanation. Perhaps, in the end, the shop wasn't just haunted by its past. Perhaps it was haunted by the memories of the people who had walked through its doors, their stories lingering like the scent of flowers long after they were gone. A spirit in the bedroom. When I was 8 years old, I went through an experience that has stayed with me throughout my life, lingering like a shadow in the back of my mind, never fully leaving. It was a time marked by deep emotional turmoil and confusion, when my childhood innocence was shattered by moments of pain that I could never fully understand. My father, who had always been distant and unpredictable, had just beaten me, an all too common event in my young life. That particular night, the beating was worse than usual. The anger in his eyes had burned through me, leaving my body aching and bruised. He sent me to bed without dinner, his harsh words echoing in my ears as I walked away, my tears staining my cheeks. Lying there in the dark, curled up beneath the covers, I felt a sense of isolation that was beyond my years. The house was silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my bed, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My thoughts swirled in a chaotic whirlpool of confusion, frustration, and hurt. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but the emotional toll it took on me was growing heavier with each passing day. I felt like I was trapped in an endless cycle of pain, both physical and emotional, and I didn't know how to escape it. I lay there, my small body trembling from the cold and the pain, trying to make sense of the world that seemed so dark and unkind. I wished for comfort, for someone to tell me that everything would be okay, but in that moment, I felt utterly alone. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with thoughts that I couldn't quiet. Then, in the midst of the silence, something changed. I began to feel an odd sensation, a pull, like an invisible force urging me to move, to do something. It wasn't a voice that called to me, not a clear command or thought, but a subtle sensation, almost like an instinct that told me to lift the covers from my head. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something in me told me that I needed to do this, to uncover my face and open my eyes, even though I felt so vulnerable in the darkness. I slowly lifted the edge of the blanket, and when I did, I saw something that I couldn't explain, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. At the foot of my bed, standing in the stillness of the room, was a woman. She stood perfectly still, her figure shimmering with an ethereal glow, as though she was not entirely part of the physical world. Her form was faint, almost translucent, yet distinctly present. She wore a simple white dress, the fabric flowing gently around her, moving as if it were caught in an invisible breeze. Her face was soft, serene, but there was something otherworldly about her expression, a quiet calm that radiated from her and filled the room with a sense of peace. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at her, frozen in place, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I thought at first that it was my mother, but even in my shocked state, I knew that it couldn't be. My mother had been murdered when I was just 16 months old, her life taken too soon, and I had grown up without her. I had only vague, fragmented memories of her from the few pictures I'd seen, but I knew deep down that the woman standing before me wasn't her. And yet, there was something about her that felt familiar, a connection that I couldn't explain. It was as though she had always been a part of me, a presence that I had somehow known, even though I had never seen her before. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing. Was she a spirit? A ghost of some kind? Or was she simply a manifestation of my own grief, the deep longing for a mother that I had never truly known? I couldn't say. My young mind struggled to process the experience, unsure whether it was real or just a product of my emotional state at the time. But what I did know was that she was there, and her presence was undeniable. I could feel her warmth, the energy that surrounded her, and it was comforting in a way that nothing else had ever been. There was no fear in her presence, no sense of danger or malevolence. Instead, all I felt was a strange, soothing calm, a peace that washed over me like a wave. It was the kind of peace I had never known before, especially not after the cruelty I had just endured at the hands of my father. The ache in my body seemed to fade away, replaced by a deep sense of tranquility. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt safe. The room, which had felt so dark and oppressive just moments before, now seemed to be filled with a gentle light, as if she had brought with her a sense of calm that banished the shadows. I don't know how long I stared at her, but in that time, the world outside my small bedroom seemed to disappear. It was as if she existed in a space all her own, a place where the rules of the physical world didn't apply. I didn't feel the cold of the room or the pain in my body anymore. I felt something different, something like love, or at least a semblance of it, something that made me believe for a fleeting moment that perhaps there was more to life than the darkness I had known. As I looked at her, I realized that I wasn't afraid. She wasn't a threat to me. She wasn't here to hurt me. In fact, it felt as though she was there to offer me comfort, to remind me that I wasn't truly alone, even though the world around me often made me feel like I was. But just as quickly as she had appeared, she began to fade. Her form became less distinct, her glow dimming until she was nothing more than a soft blur in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. The room returned to its previous stillness. The darkness crept back in, but the strange sense of calm she had left behind lingered, like the aftertaste of a sweet, fleeting moment. I lay back down, my mind racing with questions that I would never be able to answer. Was she real? Was she a spirit, or was she just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the pain and loneliness I felt? I would never know for sure, but what I did know was that she had offered me something that I had desperately needed: comfort in a time of deep sorrow, a moment of peace in the chaos of my young life. For years after that night, I carried the memory of that woman with me. I would often think back on her, wondering who she was and what her appearance had meant. Was she a spirit of some kind, sent to watch over me, or was she just a manifestation of my own desperate need for maternal love? I never found an answer, but I didn't need one. What mattered was that she had been there, when I needed her most. Even now, as an adult, I can still see her in my mind's eye, standing at the foot of my bed, glowing softly in the darkness. I can still feel the sense of peace that washed over me, and I still wonder what her visit meant. I've never been able to forget her, that quiet, serene figure in the room with me on that long ago night. In the end, I suppose that's all I can ask for: a memory that has stayed with me, a moment of grace in a world that often felt devoid of it. And while I still don't fully understand what happened that night, I know one thing for certain: I was never truly alone. The vanishing girl. I scooted across the mattress, the sheets tangled around my legs as I reached for the light switch. The darkness had wrapped itself around the room like a suffocating blanket, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. My heart was pounding as my hand fumbled for the switch, the cold plastic against my fingertips feeling foreign and strange. The silence was deafening, like the world outside had ceased to exist. And then, finally, I turned on the lamp. For a split second, nothing happened. The dim light flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the room, but it was then that I saw it. The corner, where she had been sitting just moments ago, was now empty. There was no sign of the girl. No overalls draped over the back of a chair. No small, delicate figure hunched in the shadows. Just the empty space that seemed to mock me with its quiet stillness. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. She had been there. I had seen her with my own eyes, her pale face barely visible in the dim light, her eyes watching me from the corner of the room. But now nothing. The corner was just as empty as the rest of the room, save for the soft glow of the lamp. I glanced around the room, my pulse racing. Nothing. No signs of a struggle. No movement. Just the unsettling emptiness. My mind raced for an explanation. Had I imagined it? Had I dreamt the entire thing? No. No, I knew what I had seen. She had been there. She had been real. But where had she gone? I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me, as if the very foundation of the room was shifting under my feet. My gaze moved from one corner to the next, scanning for any trace of the girl, but there was nothing. Just the familiar, dusty furniture, the old portraits hanging crooked on the walls, and the quiet hum of the house itself. The house. That house. It had always been strange. Even when I was a child, I'd known there was something not quite right about it. The creaks in the floorboards, the whispers that seemed to echo through the hallways, the cold drafts that would send chills down my spine. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. And yet, despite all of that, I had always loved it. It was my home. A place filled with history and memories that no amount of weirdness could erase. But now it felt different. I couldn't explain why, but something had shifted. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like the room was holding its breath. My heart was racing, and I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine, like something was watching me from the shadows. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just my imagination, I told myself. There was no reason to be afraid. I was alone in the house, and there was no one else around to. But then I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it, but it was there. It came from the corner of the room, the same corner where the girl had been. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, a soft, almost melodic hum, like a lullaby being sung from a distance. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the sadness in the tone. It was haunting. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room, but there was still no sign of her. No figure in the corner. No movement. Just the soft hum of the whisper, growing louder with each passing second. My skin prickled with unease as the air around me seemed to grow colder. I felt as though I was being pulled into the very fabric of the room itself, as though the house was swallowing me whole. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on my heel and ran from the room, the door slamming shut behind me as I fled down the hall. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled down the staircase. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, throwing it open and stepping out into the cool night air. The world outside felt so much more real, so much more grounded than the house I had just left behind. But even as I stood there, catching my breath in the moonlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the house with me. Something that had been there for years, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I had always known the house was strange, but I had never truly understood how strange until that night. Despite the eerie encounters, despite the whispers and the strange happenings that seemed to follow me wherever I went, I still loved that house. I couldn't explain it, but it was a part of me. A part of my past. A place where memories were made, where time seemed to stand still. And so, we kept it. We still owned it. Every year, we visited it, despite the strange occurrences, the chill that would settle over us whenever we entered, the feeling that we were never truly alone. But every year, as I walked through the rooms and looked at the old portraits, the faded photographs, and the worn furniture, I couldn't help but wonder about the girl. Who was she? Why had she appeared in that corner? And why had she vanished so suddenly, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of something unfinished? Perhaps, in some strange way, the house had never really let go of its past. Perhaps it was still holding onto the memories of the people who had once lived there, the echoes of their lives still lingering in the air, waiting for someone to remember them. Maybe the girl was just one of those echoes. A part of the house's strange and mysterious history that could never truly be explained. Whatever the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, full of secrets and memories, and it was never truly done with any of us. It held us all in its grasp, whether we were ready for it or not. And as long as we continued to visit, it would always be there waiting, watching, and whispering from the shadows. The figure in the barracks. One morning, I woke up suddenly at 5 a.m. without any apparent reason. There was no noise, no disturbances, no external factors that would explain the sudden jolt from my sleep. It wasn't the typical alarm ringing or a shift in the air conditioning, it was just instinct. I sat up quickly, my heart already pounding in my chest, the adrenaline rushing through my veins as if my body had anticipated something that my mind had not. There was no sense of danger, no feeling of unease, just a strange, inexplicable clarity that urged me to wake up. With a grogginess I tried to shake off, I glanced around the dimly lit room of the barracks. Everything was as it should be: the standard issue furniture, the gray walls, the small window letting in the faintest hint of morning light. But my eyes immediately darted to the door. For reasons I couldn't place, I felt the need to focus on it. And then, something happened. The door creaked open, just a small fraction, as though it were disturbed by some unseen force. It was unsettling in its quietness, a delicate movement that felt intentional, like the door wasn't just moving on its own but was being carefully nudged. I held my breath, unsure of what to make of it. My instinct told me to call out or get up, but I couldn't move. I felt frozen. From the darkness outside the door, a figure emerged. It was slow, deliberate. The figure stepped halfway into the room, pausing as if to study the space. It was a bizarre sight. It wasn't a soldier, it wasn't one of the guys from the unit, it wasn't even human in any normal sense of the word. It was an entity, something otherworldly, draped in a long, flowing robe that seemed to shimmer with an ethereal light. The robe seemed to have a glow of its own, the edges soft and pulsing as though caught in an invisible breeze, undisturbed by the stillness of the room. But what disturbed me most was its face, or rather, the lack of one. It had no features. The space where a face should have been was smooth, an empty void. A blank, featureless surface that seemed to absorb the light, almost as if the figure were not entirely real, but a projection or an apparition. The absence of eyes, a nose, or a mouth gave it an eerie quality that rendered it even more unsettling. I couldn't look away. My mind screamed for me to turn my head, to make sense of it, but I was paralyzed by the sight. The figure lingered for what felt like an eternity, though I'm sure it was only a few seconds. It seemed to be surveying the room, assessing the very space I occupied. There was no sound, no movement, just an oppressive silence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Then, without warning, the figure retreated, moving backward as smoothly as it had appeared. It didn't hurry, it simply backed out of the room in a fluid motion, like it was never truly there. The door slammed shut behind it with a force that echoed through the barracks. The sound of the door crashing back into place was deafening in the quiet, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. The room fell back into its original stillness, as if nothing had ever happened. For a moment, I sat in disbelief. I was wide awake, heart racing, yet everything in the room was as it had been before. I reached over to the door, still locked, and gently pushed it open to confirm what I had seen. There was no sign of any intruder, no sign that anything had happened. The hallway outside was just as empty as it had been before. What made the encounter even more perplexing was the fact that the door had opened in the wrong direction, against the hinges, as if something or someone had made it do so. It wasn't just an ordinary draft or malfunction, the door had clearly moved in a way that defied any logical explanation. It should have been impossible, yet there it was, an undeniable anomaly in the middle of an otherwise ordinary morning. This incident occurred in my room at the Army barracks on Fort Carson, a place that, up until that moment, had been entirely unremarkable. The barracks were typical stark, utilitarian, and filled with the buzz of soldiers going through their daily routines. But after that encounter, everything changed. The normalcy of the barracks was replaced with a strange and unsettling atmosphere that lingered long after the event had passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as though that encounter had shifted the very air around me. Over the following weeks, I couldn't help but feel a presence in the room, even when I was alone. It was as if the entity had left an imprint, something residual that I couldn't explain. I would hear faint noises in the hallway at odd hours, feel the cold air shift around me in the middle of the night, and sometimes, I thought I saw glimpses of that figure standing just out of my line of sight. But no matter how many times I tried to investigate or confront it, there was never any trace of the entity again. It was like it had never existed at all, yet the memory of it haunted me. That experience was a turning point for me, altering my perception of the world in a way I can't quite explain. I came to realize that there are things in the world, things that cannot be seen or understood, that exist alongside us. the unknown, the unexplainable, and the unsettling forces that may sometimes cross our paths. And while I had grown accustomed to the barracks and its routines, after that night, I always felt like I was being watched, as if that figure from the doorway was still lingering, just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The closet hangers. When I was 17, I was hanging out with my ex at her house, something that felt like a quiet, ordinary afternoon. We were on her bed, just talking, lost in the humdrum of teenage life. The air felt still and calm, the kind of stillness that made everything seem normal until it didn't. I remember looking over at the closet across the room, where a row of empty hangers hung neatly on the metal rod. It was just one of those things you don't think about, part of the usual clutter in any room. But then, something changed. Suddenly, with no wind, no movement, and no clear cause, the hangers started to sway. Not gently, like they were swishing in the air, but with a force that seemed unnatural. They moved as if a hand had brushed through them, long and deliberate. The sound of the metal rods creaking against each other broke the silence of the room, a sound that made my heart skip a beat. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and I looked over at my ex. She saw it too. The confusion was written all over her face. We both sat there, frozen. Neither of us had an explanation. The window was shut, the fan wasn't on, and the room felt oddly heavy. It wasn't just the hangers swaying, it was the fact that they were moving with such force, almost violently. They jerked back and forth, as if something was trying to communicate with us, or worse, trying to get our attention. I couldn't take my eyes off the hangers, my stomach twisted with a mix of confusion and anxiety. I tried to rationalize it, but my mind couldn't settle on an explanation. There was no breeze, no reason for them to be moving like that. I turned to my ex, wanting to say something, but words failed me. I hadn't believed in spirits or ghosts before, but this situation was impossible to ignore. Feeling a nervous energy, I blurted out something I hadn't planned on saying. I mean you no harm, spirit, but I acknowledge your presence. It was a strange thing to say, like some sort of old ritual, but the moment I said it, the movement stopped. The hangers stilled, and the room felt lighter. The oppressive feeling that had hung in the air disappeared as quickly as it had come. The silence returned, and I could hear the soft hum of the house settling back into itself. I looked at my ex, who was still staring at the closet with wide eyes. She didn't say anything at first, but I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You know, this isn't the first time something like that has happened. She went on to tell me about the strange occurrences in the house, things that had been happening for years. Her dad's ex-wife had moved out a while ago, and ever since then, the house had felt off. Doors would close on their own, strange cold spots would appear in random rooms, and sometimes, there was this feeling of being watched, even when no one else was around. It was the kind of unease that stayed with you long after the lights went out. Her dad had gotten a priest to bless the house, thinking it might help with the strange energy they had been feeling. But my ex believed that the blessing hadn't done what it was supposed to. In her eyes, it had only trapped something in the house, something that had no intention of leaving. The more she spoke, the more I realized that whatever had been haunting her house wasn't just some random occurrence. It was something that had attached itself to the place, something that wasn't going to go away easily. The hangers swaying in the closet had been a sign, a reminder that the house wasn't as empty as we'd thought. We didn't talk much more about it after that. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was more frightened by what we had experienced or by the strange sense of calm that had followed. But when I left that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something that couldn't be explained away. The hangers in the closet had been a warning, a moment that would stay with me long after I walked out the door. As I left her house, I couldn't help but wonder how many other strange things had happened there that we hadn't noticed. I also wondered what had really happened when her dad called the priest. Did the blessing work, or had it only made things worse? Was something still lingering in the house, waiting for its next chance to make itself known? Even now, years later, I still think about that moment. The empty hangers swaying, moving as though they were touched by something unseen. I wonder if my ex ever experienced anything like it again. And I wonder if, in some way, the spirit, or whatever it was, is still trapped in that house, waiting for someone else to acknowledge its presence. The figure in the trunk expanded. One evening, my girlfriend was at my house, and she was preparing to leave for the night. We had spent a quiet evening together, watching movies and talking about life. As she got into her car and started the engine, something odd happened. Her automatic gate opener, which had always worked seamlessly before, suddenly malfunctioned. The gate remained stubbornly shut, no matter how much she tried to use the remote. After a few failed attempts, she sighed in frustration and decided to get out of the car to open it manually. She stepped out, moved over to the gate, and pulled it open. She got back in, drove through, and then had to stop and get out again to close it. This was nothing out of the ordinary, just an inconvenience. But when she got back into her car and glanced in her rearview mirror to check if the gate had closed properly, she froze. There, in the reflection, she saw something that made her heart stop. There was a figure hunched over unnaturally in the trunk of her car. Her eyes widened in shock, and without thinking, she screamed and looked away from the mirror. When she finally dared to look back, the figure was gone. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she immediately called me, her voice trembling with fear. She begged me to come outside and check the car, insisting that she had seen something she couldn't explain. When I arrived, I found her shaking and terrified, still standing by the car. I opened the trunk and checked the back seat, but everything was just as it should be, nothing out of place, no figure, no sign of anything strange. I reassured her that everything was fine, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel an unsettling chill crawl down my spine. She wasn't making this up. She had seen something. She admitted, after a few moments, that she had been feeling unusually drowsy just before the incident. But despite this, she was absolutely sure of what she had seen. Her conviction in the event made me question if it had truly been a hallucination or if there was something more sinister at play. I couldn't explain it, and neither could she. All I knew was that the image of the figure in the trunk lingered in my mind long after the night ended. Was it just a trick of the mind? Or was something otherworldly at work? The Pheasant Hill Legend, expanded. I've lived near Pheasant Hill Parks in Indiana for most of my life, a place known for its dense woods and the occasional school that stands just on the edge of it. Over the years, I've spent countless hours walking through the area, particularly around Halloween, when the atmosphere grows thick with mystery and folklore. The woods have always had an eerie quality to them, as if they were watching you back. The feeling of being observed, though unsettling, was something I thought was just a product of my overactive imagination. But there was something different about the air in Pheasant Hill, a heaviness, a lingering unease that couldn't easily be explained away. Locals often spoke of an old legend that had been passed down for generations, a story of a lumberjack who once lived in a small cabin deep in the woods. In the early 1900s, tragedy struck when a train collided with him as he tried to cross the tracks. He didn't survive, and it's said that his restless spirit has haunted the woods ever since. The most chilling part of the story was that on Halloween night, the anniversary of his death, his ghost would appear. The legend claimed that anyone who ventured too deep into the woods on that night would experience the lumberjack's wrath, or at the very least, encounter his sorrowful, wandering spirit. 3 years ago, I decided to test this local legend for myself. I had heard the stories 1,000 times, but I wasn't sure I believed them. Armed with only a flashlight and my curiosity, I decided to take a walk through the woods on Halloween night. The moment I stepped into the forest, a strange sensation washed over me, like something was there, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the air felt thick and oppressive, as though I was being followed by unseen eyes. The further I walked, the stronger the feeling became. I heard rustling noises around me, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. My breath quickened, and the temperature seemed to drop. Every now and then, I thought I caught a glimpse of something, an outline in the shadows, a flash of movement at the corner of my vision. My mind raced, but I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just my nerves. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more I realized that the sensation of being watched was not just in my head. It was real. As I reached the farthest edge of the woods, the rustling grew louder, almost deafening. I swore I heard footsteps behind me, echoing through the trees. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing there. The feeling of being trapped, of not being alone, consumed me. I decided it was time to leave. I ran back to the edge of the woods as fast as my legs could carry me, the sounds of the forest following me, like something was chasing me. When I finally reached the safety of the streetlights, the oppressive feeling lifted, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that I had narrowly avoided something far worse than a ghost. I have not returned to the woods since that night. Whether it was the legend, my overactive imagination, or something more tangible, I'm not sure. But I will never again test that legend, no matter how much I doubt it. Some things are better left unexplored. The floating worm-like thing, expanded. One evening, I was sitting on the couch with my boyfriend, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. We were enjoying a quiet night in, nothing out of the ordinary. The TV was off, the lights dimmed, and the only sound was the soft hum of the fridge in the background. As I scrolled through my feed, I noticed something unusual, a small, black dot floating in the air above us. It seemed insignificant at first, just another dust particle caught in the light, but then it began to move. At first, I thought it was a spider. The shape seemed vaguely familiar, but there was something off about it. It wasn't moving like a spider. It was floating, almost gliding, without any clear direction. It didn't fall, as gravity would suggest. Instead, it seemed to hover, suspended in the air as if it had a mind of its own. I froze, staring at it in disbelief. My heart began to race as I realized that whatever it was, it wasn't natural. My boyfriend noticed my sudden stillness and looked over at me, following my gaze. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I pointed to the spot above us, but when he looked, he couldn't see anything. The small black object continued to float upward, moving without any apparent force, like it was being carried on an invisible current. It wasn't a piece of fluff or a bug, I could tell. This thing, whatever it was moving in a way that didn't make sense. Slowly, almost hypnotically, it rose through the air, and as it did, I felt a shiver run down my spine. My boyfriend asked again, "Are you sure you're not seeing things?" But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The strange, black, worm-like thing drifted slowly up toward the ceiling, almost as if it had a purpose, a destination in mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished through the ceiling. It didn't fall, it didn't fly away. It simply disappeared. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but I was left speechless. My boyfriend, now looking visibly unsettled, asked again if I was sure I wasn't hallucinating. But I knew what I saw. I could still feel the weight of that strange, otherworldly experience pressing on my mind. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? Or was there something truly paranormal at play in our living room that night? I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd never seen anything like it before, and I wasn't eager to see anything like it again.